Zena Hitz, you are a tutor at St. John's College, and you just published a book called Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasure of an Intellectual Life, where you explore the meaning and value of learning for its own sake. You also give lectures on leisure and its necessity for human beings. Tina, thank you for being here with us.
It's great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me.
So, Tina, this book is of great interest for me because I'm one of those persons who like to learn with no other purpose than just to entertain myself. I mean, there is people who like Netflix for no purpose other than to entertain themselves, and there is people who just prefer books, literature, history, philosophy, so on and so forth. So when I found out about your book, then I said, "Wow, this is the kind this is the kind of ideology that needs to be spread a little bit wider." Sena, can we start by you sharing a little bit of your background? Just how do you get interested in this intellectual life?
Okay, so I'll say a bit about my background. I grew up in a family that liked to read and liked to argue, but we weren't professionals. My parents were, my father was taught childcare for young children. He was an early childhood person. My mother uh, worked part-time at various things, but we liked to read and we liked to argue, and that was with me for a young age. And so just as you say, as a matter of pleasure, as a matter of leisure, as a way of being alive, without any agendas, so to speak, attached to it. I went to a small liberal arts college that we have. There are a few in Canada, but also a few more in the U.S., where we read very old books and talked about them. And again, it was not a professional degree. It was not a degree that was going to make me a lot of money. It was something that was worth doing for my own development and for my fellow students as well. So I became a professional academic. I became an expert in classical philosophy. And I found as time went on that I lost touch with that amateur love of learning, with the sense of freedom and spontaneity that one has when one is learning for no other reason than for its own sake. And I didn't feel also that I was passing on that to my students. So I had a bit of a crisis, a midlife crisis, and I quit my job, quit the profession. I lived in a Canadian Catholic community for a time called Madonna House in Eastern Ontario. And then I realized that what I really needed to do is to try to find a way to return to my old life, but in a way that nurtured those habits and those intellectual practices which I had been raised in, and which I think really are essential for being a human being. So I've been teaching back at my old liberal arts college, and I've been doing this writing where I'm trying to reach as broad an audience as I can and tell them how important I think this is, in the hopes of encouraging people who may be doing it on their own, and in hopes of influencing people who might have some power to help it continue and flourish.
Okay, but there is this such a huge backlash against taking any humanity classes, any liberal arts classes, any studies for the sake of just studying. I mean, we hear all the time you have to study either accounting or finance or engineering or computer coding, and if you don't do that, it is portrayed that your only option is either going to become a professor or to work in Starbucks as a barista. So how do you were able to face these challenges and justify to yourself and to society in general that this is the path that you wanted to take?
The backlash is enormous, and it has an effect. Even if I never was a true believer in career training, but I was certainly concerned that are you can you still hear me?
Yes.
I'm back again.
Okay.
I'm back again. I think it might just be like this for a little bit, but I'll just keep picking up where we left off if that's okay with you.
Yes, please.
Uh, it there's a huge backlash. It's very difficult to think clearly about these questions because of how dominant it is. Even if you don't really believe it, it's hard to think clearly about it. So I think I really, honestly, for me, I had to be in this remote, strange place for 3 years in Eastern Ontario, where the very different set of values. I think that helped me to get some clarity on what mattered in my life and what I really wanted to care about. So that was how I did it for myself. And then I felt when I started to write, I felt very isolated, very alone in the world. I thought I might be the only person who would say something like this. And what I've found is that, in fact, that huge backlash, that huge sense of inevitability is more fragile than it looks because there are many, many people out there who love to learn for its own sake, who know that it's important, and are just looking for words to understand that with, for ways to think about it, for other people to connect with. So I've been very encouraged by what's happened since I started writing. I think the idea has much more traction than you would know from following what the powers that be want us to say and to think.
Right. Okay. But in a world where, I mean, a student, there is an epidemic of student debt, and education itself is so expensive. I mean, if I was a parent, my kids tells me, okay, I'm going to get into a huge debt to study philosophy. I will ask him once or twice, are you sure about that? Or how are you going to be able to pay that? So even though I believe that learning for any learning sakes is beneficial to us, I will even question my child about his choices, and I don't know of many other parents who would do otherwise.
Well, I think there's a few things to say about that. One is that the universities clearly have significant difficulties. That's not an original thought to me. So something has to be done in Canada, in the US, wherever you are. There, it seems to be a widespread phenomenon. Um, we need to make it easier for students who want to learn. Um, I also think, though, that it's not quite true that these degrees in philosophy, say, are really useless. It's very good training for all kinds of walks of life. Being trained in the latest thing is actually very fragile because the world changes, and then you've been trained in something that doesn't work anymore. So developing yourself as a person is smart for the future as well. So that's all true. I also think that I want to defend this as a human activity because uh, I want to make an argument that's a bit secure from whatever our circumstances are or whatever happens in the future. So if our universities all get worse, I mean, maybe they'll get better. I hope that they do. I hope that they reform and renew themselves. Suppose they keep going in this direction, then you know what we're going to have to do? We'll have to build some institutions that nurture this activity in one another, in our young people, in our old people, in our middle-aged people, in people who have careers, in people who don't have careers, in with achievers, with failures, with everybody. And that's what we have to do if the universities can't take this responsibility seriously. So it's meant to be a very general kind of argument. uh, this is an activity that really matters for human beings. I think it would be wonderful if universities returned some attention to it. I think it'd be wonderful if universities reformed their other difficulties to the point where it became easier for students to make these choices, which are good for them. But I also think if the universities can't do it, then we have to do it another way.
Wow. Okay. And why would you say that the idea of learning for learning sakes is kind of like a snobbish elitism, uh, reserved for only millionaires who don't know what to do with their own time or money?
See, I find this to just not be true, as a matter of fact. So it is traditional. Um, so in ancient Greece, where in the West, at least, many of these through which we receive a lot of these things, um, that was the belief that only people with wealth and leisure could do these things. People who worked with their hands were too marred by this work with their hands to do this kind of thinking. But I think it's been true for a very long time that working people not only can do this kind of work, but in a way, the fact that they're not professional intellectuals, the fact that they work with their hands or have work that's more, even more simple than that, that's cleaning or healthcare or um, food service, uh, people like that often have their minds free to really think about things, and they too can live a full human life, and they do. So since I started this making these arguments, knowing a little bit of history, knowing, for instance, that at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, there were large working class intellectual movements in the UK, in Canada, in the US, where working people got together and taught each other how to think, how to read, just for its own sake, just to become more human, just to recover a bit of the diminishment that their work was putting on them, to get back their dignity. Uh, so I knew that, and I was idealistic. I thought it should be for everyone. But since I started writing again, I now hear stories all the time. Oh, my father was a janitor, but he read constantly. He knew everything. Oh, my uncle, he was a mechanic, but he read and thought and was always the most interesting person to talk to. So I know that this is just a fact, and I think that it's a huge mistake to make decisions that are in fact going to shut off. Uh, of course, the people at the bottom always suffer worse of whatever is going on. So whatever is going on in education, working people are going to get the worst of it. I think it's very dangerous to feed into that dynamic by calling it an elite activity. It's for everybody. And I think if you look around and study a bit, that becomes obviously true.
Okay, and so I mean, most people what they do with their leisure time is, let's say, let's use Netflix for example, or social media, or one of these activities that uh, people could use in other ways, such as learning for learning's sake. So let me ask you, how do we make learning for learning's sake more sexy instead of talking next to the water cooler about the latest programming in Netflix? How do we get people excited about, I don't know, Plato or Aristotle or whatever, San Agustin? How can we entice people's curiosity to dip their toes into these kind of subjects?
Well, I think two things can help. One is that I think any kind of, as with anything, any kind of personal connection helps. So if you have a friend who you think might enjoy reading a book like this, like decide to read something with them, something that would be a bit difficult. Look, even myself, I've been studying these books my whole life. I'm a trained professional. I do it for a living. Even I need someone to read with if I'm going to undertake something that's really challenging. So right now, even I'm reading Proust. It's quite difficult. It's
I read
fiction.
Proust. Yes,
Eh,
I read Proust. It's
it's
horrible.
literature, but it's quite difficult. And if I weren't reading it with a class with students, I wouldn't be able to do it. I would have given up. Uh, so a little bit of community helps. A friend, a group of people to read with, and I think that that's one thing that can work for you. Just a little bit of community. And again, if we can build some institutions through libraries or schools or however it works to help people connect with others who might want to do this, I think that will help. But the other thing that I think works in favor of it is that it's easier for me and for everyone else to turn on Netflix, to go on Twitter, it's just the default. You're tired, you're anxious. These are the things which you reach for first. But I think, have all experienced that over time it wears on you. It doesn't really renew you. It doesn't really make your life better. It's a kind of distraction that over time kind of wears you down. So I think if the more experience a person has with reading and thinking and serious conversation, the easier it gets, and the more fulfilling it gets, and then the easier it is to kind of pull yourself out of the simpler, the shorter track, and get yourself into something that really matters. It's like anything like that in that way. I mean, exercise or art, any kind of creative endeavor, you have to practice your guitar in order to get good at it. It's just like that, and it can be helped in just those same ways that we do all those other things.
Okay, so let's say a person wants to, uh, after listening to our conversation, they feel curious and they want to get started into, I don't know, learning more about literature, philosophy, what give. And well, you are a professional in this and you have ventured into Saint Augustine, Malcolm X, now Proust. But a person who doesn't know anything, where could they get started? Is there some kind of recommended reading list or courses online or YouTube channel to give them some ideas of where to get started into being curious?
So there are a number of online resources. If you look through things under the title, so the Great Books Foundation, Agora Foundation, there's a new group whose name is just slipping my mind, that a website where they assemble these things. And the last thing I would recommend would be, these are all places where you can not just get a list, but can find a course or a reading group with whom you can connect. Um, the last thing I would mention is that I do have a small operation myself, called the Catherine Project, and we are trying to help people who are interested, adults without many resources maybe, who are interested in starting to read and think, to connect with one another and to form groups. So these are all things that are in the works, and also it's also something that I try to keep in my Twitter feed or my webpage. If you want to look me up, I'm always trying to find resources for ordinary people to find their way into the world of books and learning. But it's it shouldn't be. I would just encourage anyone not to be intimidated, not to be frightened. Many people do this. It's you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to get the right answer about what the book means. You'll find it worthwhile with just even a bit of experience and a bit of community. So just keep looking for the group that feels right for you, and bon courage, because it's really worth it. It's worth the effort.
And what could you recommend right now to my listeners as a way to start exploring, let's say, philosophy, history, literature, to go back on time, to go into a particular time periods, to, I don't know, to go into particular authors? What would be a action that we could take right now after listening to this podcast?
Well, you can. The difficulty is, I'm not a big fan of single recipes that apply to everybody. There's something that you, the listener, are interested in. I don't know what it is. It might be history, it might be philosophy. Um, Go find a book about it and start reading. If you're interested in philosophy, say, Plato's Dialogues, there's a little collection paperback, 5 dialogues. They're readable, they're fascinating, they provoke all kinds of interesting questions. Order that book if you're interested in philosophy. You're interested in literature, read Homer, the Iliad or the Odyssey. But again, if most likely people have an interest that they're already kind of chewing over, and they just need to dig a little deeper, and find someone to connect with about it.
Okay, in your website, you made it a point to call yourself a tutor instead of a teacher, professor, or a gift. Can you tell us why or what is your role as a tutor and different from just a regular teacher?
Yes, so I teach at an experimental liberal arts college called St. John's, and one of the things we do, our readings are all based on original sources, so great books from the Western tradition. Um, and one of our traditions is to give our students a fair amount of authority in the classroom. So we are not professors. We are not passing on information to them. We are facilitating their independent learning, which they're pursuing with their own questions and working with one another. So, in order to signal that we are not authorities, that we are not pushing an educational agenda, we call ourselves tutors rather than professors. So that's the story behind my title. It's a sign that I consider myself as a teacher, more someone who helps my students do their own thinking, rather than someone who delivers my thoughts to others and makes them memorize them and spit them back out to me.
And how is a class in St. John's College different from a class at, let's say, McGill University?
Well, it's funny. So I taught at McGill for a semester, as you know, in philosophy. I had absolutely incredible students, wonderful students. But I had a class of 60 students or 70 students, and it was a lecture. And there were too many students even for me to read all the papers myself. There was a graduate student who was the grader. He read the papers and he graded. I gave lectures. Because the students were so brilliant, they asked tons of questions and we had conversations. But what often happens in other schools with less talented students is they become very passive, and they just learn what they have to learn, that they have to repeat on the test or the exam or in the paper or in the assignment in order to get the kind of grade that they want, and then that's it. So you don't get this free, open-ended, spontaneous pursuit of fundamental questions, which is really fundamental to the type of learning that I'm interested in. It needs to be one's own questions. It needs to be free. It needs to be spontaneous, and it needs to get down to the bottom of something. It can't be trivial. And so that's what we cultivate at my college and other places too. I think King's College in Nova Scotia, that's the famous place in Canada, or Our Lady Seat of Wisdom in Barry's Bay in Ontario. So there's also Canadian versions, but this is what we do at the school where I teach and where I was a student.
So your class at McGill was about 60 students, but right now, how many students do you have in a classroom?
In a given class, 15 or
Wow,
20.
what a
Yeah.
what a
So
pleasure to be in that classroom then.
Well, yes, and we have our students for a full year. We get to know them personally. We meet with them one on one. We work with them quite carefully. So I'll tell you this, it's much more work to teach this way. It's a pleasure because you get to know your students, but it's very demanding on teachers, much more demanding than an ordinary professor's life is. So it's a cost, which is one of the reasons why it's not only unpopular with administrators who are concerned about the expense of having such a small class, but it's a bit unpopular even with professors because they want their teaching to take up a bit less of their mental and psychological space, and that's another thing that I'm trying to address in my work is this person-to-person teaching is what it's all about. It's what really matters, and it's really fundamental to what a college or university is. And we've got to try to get back to it as best we can for our own sake as well as for the sake of our students.
Right. Okay, and I heard from a source that you are a workaholic. So my question now is, being that you have a lot of work and getting to know all these students one on one, how do you? What was the motivation to write this book, and how you managed to put the time aside in order to get it out?
Well, I'm glad you didn't go for the more brutal question, which is I talk a lot in my work about leisure and contemplation and how it's not about achievement. I promote values that are very much at odds with my life as a workaholic. So the truth is, I work too much. That's how I do it. I have I got, thanks be to God, a little grant to write the main manuscript of this book. So I had a semester's leave to write the main first draft. Otherwise, I live a very hectic, chaotic life where I teach 1 minute, I write the next, I'm on podcasting in the third, um, and I think every week, I've got to really work this out and find a more leisured way of life. And I don't do it. So that's how it all works.
Right, but why do you feel the need to write this book? I mean, you are so
Oh, I
busy
see.
already.
I see. I really feel it was we're at a time of it's a funny thing too because I also talk about how intellectual life isn't about politics and it's about your own development. But the truth is, it's a political concern or a social concern. I think we're at a real moment of crisis in education in the U.S. and in other countries, and I think we're really in danger of losing these practices, and um, not just because of all of the forces, economic and social, that are arrayed against these activities and practices, but also because people like us who like to read and think don't have confidence in what we're doing, and we don't know how to talk openly and freely and about what we really care about, why we do these things, and why they matter. I don't think that what I've said is perfect. It was an attempt to be honest about it, and I hope that what happens is that more people who think like us will feel encouraged to just speak their mind, say why you're doing it. So much of what I was reading 5 or 6 years ago about the crisis in the universities, it was all trying to justify philosophy, literature, history in terms that were really foreign to it. You don't go to study philosophy to make money. It will actually help you make money, but that's not why you do it. So we have to stop patronizing our audiences and be frank about what we really care about and why, and offer it to other people in the spirit of generosity and hope. And I just felt that that was too important not to do it. So that's why I kill myself doing it. Apart from uh, my fear of my own emptiness and unwillingness to face whatever it is that I'm avoiding by doing all this work in my personal, in the depths of my soul.
Right. Okay. But you also give lectures on leisure. When you give lectures on leisure, are you talking mostly about reading for pleasure, or are you talking also about other kind of leisure? Let's say walking down the park, or I don't know, bird watching, or what give? What are you really referring to when you teach us about leisure?
So leisure for me is a bit of a philosophical term. So it doesn't mean necessarily everything like that might fall under the leisure industry. Not every type of recreation or entertainment for me counts as leisure. What leisure is it's a space where you pursue the activities that your work is for. So um, your life can't be for the point of work. You can't work to make money and then use the money to support your working life. That doesn't make any sense. So there has to be something that you're doing that gives your life its point. Maybe it's a bunch of things, maybe it's one thing, but a leisure activity is one where you're doing whatever you're doing just for its own sake, and in some way it's an activity in which your life culminates. So reading, thinking, bird watching, um, spending time appreciating your family, that's very common. Spending time outdoors, just looking at things. all of these things count as leisure. And it's important for people like myself to carve out space to cultivate them, and so that we're in touch with what really matters in our lives.
And ironically enough, when we do deliberate resting or leisure, we can end up being more productive at work. I mean, I have interviews where the person takes this amount of time to paint or to go dancing and take a ballroom lesson or other kind of activities that at the end of the day make them more productive when they have to go back to the office.
That's true, but I'm reluctant to use that kind of argument because that suggests that work is really the final end. It's like there's nothing better you could be doing than working. So it's all true that you're more productive that way, but that's not why you should do it. You should
Right.
do it because these are the things which make your life worth living, and meaningful, and give it something to hold it together. Otherwise, what do you're just working, you're just doing activities that matter for other people. You're not really living. So, uh,
Right. Yeah, it's yes. It's just that that's the message that we are bombarded with every day of our life. You have to do this to become more productive, to be more successful. Oh, you want to be a success in life. This is what you have to do. And, forget about your friends or forget about you have to make sacrifices. And yes, that message is just what we hear day in and day out. And if you don't do this, then you are a loser. And yeah, it's hard to get rid of all these messages and just take leisure for its own sake because it's fun, and to learn because it's fun, and that stimulates our brain. So I get you. At the same time, I'm a victim myself of the
yeah,
constant bombardment that I receive every day. And in part, this podcast, I'm not only am I guilty, but I also propagate the idea that these are the ways that we can be more successful in life. And it just takes a little bit of practice and just
yeah.
thinking in order to see, well, we could just have fun for nothing other than to have fun, no, because I want to be more productive on Monday when I go back to the office.
No, I agree, but a question when a person has to ask themselves is where are all these messages coming from? Where do they come from? Sometimes they come from us because we want to be productive, we want to feel good about ourselves, we want approval from others, and sometimes there's a real good that we need. I mean, it's good to work hard, it's good to be good at something, it's good to contribute to the community in some way. That's all good. Uh, but sometimes the messages I think come from the say the people who run things, who want your labor and all of its fruits, and they want it for as cheap as possible. I think about these the funny I get cough drops every year in the winter because I get a cough, and the Hall's cough drops have these messages on them. It says, get back to work, like you can do it. You know, no pain, no gain. It's the cough drops are telling you, don't be sick, don't miss any work. Your value is only in getting things done, and this is a sickness. I mean, everyone gets a cold or a flu in the winter, and it's okay to rest for a few days while you recuperate. So you have to. It takes time to become sensitive to the different reasons why work is good and when work is bad, and to try to judge for oneself, and build for oneself a way of life that's authentic and meaningful, and truly taking advantage of the best things in it.
Wow, Sena, I tell you, your message is so refreshing. I wonder, the last question, of course, is if you can tell one more time the listeners the title of your book and where they can find you or follow you.
So the book is called Lost in Thought: The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life. I collect some writings and reviews on a website, zenahitz.net. That's ZENAHITZ.net. And I have a Twitter account where I post news and various findings I have about adult education. And my adult education endeavor, which is not quite around, but keep an eye out for it, it's called the Catherine Project. So there's no website yet, but there will be. So search for it in a month or two. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.